Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Loretta Yarlow, Director of the University Museum of Contemporary Art, the UMCA. I want to say first of all, by saying what a great pleasure and honor to have Terry Winters back again to UMass Amherst. Really thrilled to have you here, Terry, and thrilled to have the honor and pleasure to have him join tonight in conversation with Peter Cole and with Nathan McClain. The topic of discussion is the meeting of art and poetry tonight. For centuries, of course, art has inspired poets, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, thinking of Ode on a Grecian Urn by John Keats. In Asian art, poetry is often written right on the painting itself, where calligraphy becomes an integral part of the visual art form. But tonight, I'm really excited to hear from Peter and Terry about a different meeting of art and poetry, where it's really a true collaborative spirit that they share. It's an ongoing collaboration over the years where they've had back and forth conversation, a special unique collaboration. Terry has worked with artists and poets in many book projects, but this is a really special project that they'll be talking about as an ongoing friendship and collaboration. I hope you've all had a chance to see Terry's exhibition at the museum. It's on until April 26th. We're staying open tonight till 8 o'clock, so after this event, you can also come down for a brief time to see the exhibition again. It was organized by the Drawing Center in New York, and it's really his first major retrospective of his drawings, and the drawings are such an important part of his artistic practice. And in the exhibition catalog, we're kind of sold out of the catalog, but you can still order the catalog from the Drawing Center, is a poem commissioned for the exhibition written by Peter Cole, which we'll talk about tonight, A Winter's Trail. Just a bit of bio. Terry's work, as you probably know, has been the subject of many museum surveys, including the Tate Gallery in London, the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, the Museum of Contemporary Art in LA, the Whitney Museum, Kunsthalle Basel, the Irish Museum of Modern Art, and to say he's been represented by the Matthew Marks Gallery in New York. Peter Cole is the author of 5 books of poems, most recently Hymns and Qualms, New and Selected Poems, and Translations, which, by the way, is being sold tonight. Amherst Books has a table outside, so if you want Peter to autograph the books, they're for sale. They're out here in the lobby. He's also had many volumes of translation from Hebrew and Arabic, medieval and modern. He's been praised for his keen moral intelligence and for the rigor, vigor, joy, and wit of his poetry. Peter has created a body of work that defies traditional distinctions between old and new, foreign and familiar, translation and original. He is, as Harold Bloom writes, a matchless translator and one of the handful of authentic poets in his own American generation. Among his many honors are an American Academy of Arts and Letters Award in Literature, a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship, a Jewish National Book Award, the Penn Prize in Translation, and a MacArthur Fellowship. Peter teaches at Yale University, and he divides his time between New Haven and Jerusalem. And I just found out tonight he's a Hampshire alum. Speaking of Hampshire, thrilled to have Nathan McClain, who will moderate the conversation tonight. He's a visiting assistant professor of creative writing and African American literary arts at Hampshire College. He's the author of Scale, 4-Way books published in 2017, and a recipient of fellowships from the Sewanee Writers Conference, the Frost Place, and the Bread Loaf Writers Conference. He's taught creative writing at Seton Hall, Drew University, and St. John's College. His poems and prose have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Upstreet, American Poets, The Rumpus, and Hunger Mountain, among others. I really want to thank the Emily Dickinson Museum, who are co-sponsors of tonight's event. And not only are they co-sponsoring tonight's event, but they're also sponsoring a workshop tomorrow right in the Emily Dickinson Museum, being organized and hosted by the museum, but it's Peter Cole who is working with students on the workshop. So if any of you have 5 college students that you know of, I think there's still room to sign up. It's essentially for 5 college students. The sign up is probably on the museum's website. So we're thrilled to have this as a 2-day event, both today and Peter's writing workshop right in Emily Dickinson's own home. And I should mention Peter was interviewed earlier today by Ilan Stavins in Ilan's NEPR podcast, In Contrast. So I'm so grateful to have Peter and Ilan in that conversation that extends the whole theme of translation and poetry. So soon we'll be able to let you know when that podcast will be on NEPR website, and we'll have a link on our website as well. A few more thanks to make Interdisciplinary Studies Institute here at UMass for their support, the Friends of the Fine Arts Center for tonight's event, thanking the theater department for allowing us to use this Rand Theater for tonight's talk. I want to also thank our own wonderful museum staff, Lyle Dennett, our installation manager, Amanda Herman, education curator, as always, their behind the scenes important work. Again, Amherst Books has the table outside, so please have a look at Peter's most recent publication, and he's here to sign for you. I'm going to turn this over to Peter, Terry, and Nathan. So please come up to the stage.
All right. And certainly a big thank you to Loretta, director of the University Museum of Contemporary Art here, for having Terry and Peter and myself. Certainly bear with me. I've been doing a fair amount of traveling, and I'm getting past the worst ends of a cold. But feeling a lot better than I sound. But certainly thank you all for being here. Certainly thank the museum and absolutely the Fine Arts Museum and just for giving us this time and space and this platform for this exhibit and project and conversation. And thank you all for celebrating National Poetry Month with us. I mean, this is certainly a time in which to do that. So I thought that maybe we would start by talking about, really just to foreground our conversation, talking about how this whole project sort of came to be, and how it evolved, what drew each of us into it, and then we can sort of move on and talk a bit more specifically about the poems from there. And maybe you want to start, Terry.
What project?
Oh, that's right. That's right.
I mean,
you have so many.
the show that's up now was organized by the Drawing Center in New York, and in the course of determining who might contribute something for the catalog, Peter was someone I suggested and whose work I've admired for quite a while, and he fortunately agreed to offer something for the catalog.
Well, and Peter, how did you come to? I mean, obviously, probably requested by Terry, but were you already familiar with Terry's work? I would imagine.
Yes, of course. I'd known Terry's work with other writers, first of all, and certainly his own work on its own. But our first point of contact was my previous individual volume of poetry, The Invention of Influence. It's kind of a crazy, uncanny story where I was looking for a cover image, and the book, I don't want to go into a song and dance what it's about, but basically the title poem is about a maverick disciple of Freud who has a kind of special ability to, first of all, feels that schizophrenics, extreme schizophrenics can be treated. Freud did not feel that. And he had these kind of overly developed, problematically developed sympathetic gifts for receptivity and for understanding blurred boundaries and porousness. And his really only claim to fame in the history of psychoanalysis is that he wrote an essay which appeared posthumously called The Influence Machine. And when I came across that notion of an influence machine, stopped me in my tracks, and I thought, yeah, I want one, you know. And I found a piece, a print that Terry had done. It was called Bond, but it was part of a series in which he was also dealing with this same figure and notion. And it just was the perfect visual correlate to the poem. And he gave me permission to use it for the book, and that started a conversation, and it evolved from there.
Yeah. And just before we move into some of these other questions, I know as Loretta was reading your bio, Terry, that you have worked with numerous writers in terms of your work before, and I was curious as to if there's a particular criteria that you have in mind when you decide that you're going to collaborate with a writer.
Just some immediate connection I feel towards the language or the use of language and its capacity to be both descriptive and abstract in some sense. I mean, I guess there's some desire on my part to connect my work with around language or with language that I think can resonate in some sense.
Okay, excellent. So as was mentioned a bit earlier, I teach at Hampshire College, and of which Peter is an alum. And if you know anything about Hampshire sort of developed this really strong reputation for its interdisciplinary approach to education and pedagogy, where students are encouraged to build committees and work across genres and medium and discipline. And I feel like there seems to be a similar kind of cross-pollination that occurs with ekphrasis. And even the sort of the scholarly review of a visual artist's work sort of functions in my mind as a kind of ekphrasis. So Terry, I was curious as to your engagement or your involvement sort of with the ekphrasis of your work in terms of like, how much involvement you have in that conversation and in that process, or do you sort of like, or do you end up leaving a bit more levity to the writer?
Completely. It's more about my interest in seeing what kind of signals come back, and that those signals can help me locate my own activities in some more specific way. So I'm not interested in directing that at all.
Okay. Yeah. And I had an opportunity, and if you get a chance, I know that the book that was done by the Drawing Center is all sold out currently, but if you get a chance to actually see it, you really should. Claire Gilman writes a really sharp and insightful introduction to Terry's work in Facts and Fictions. But I was also curious, are there ever instances in which sort of a writer kind of just really misunderstands your work's intention, be it a reviewer or if you end up working with an artist where it just seems like there's less of that kind of sort of meshing?
I mean, not in terms of people I have considered collaborators in some way. Because there's a mutual sort of back and forth that helps feed, hopefully, the energy of both of us in some way. In terms of other writing about the work, that intentions loosen once you make the work. So I don't feel as if my intentions necessarily need to be reflected back to me in some sense.
And Peter, I am also curious just to ask how you approach ekphrasis in general. If there is a particular process that you adhere to, and do you always work in conjunction with a visual artist if you're doing some sort of ekphrasis work?
I mean, ekphrastic work is something consciously or explicitly I've come to kind of fairly late in the game. Looking back, there are lots of poems that were inspired by paintings of one sort or another, but I think in a way I had a kind of traditional notion of ekphrastic work based on realistic paintings, and I liked reading those poems, but they weren't poems I wanted to write. And the work with Terry, and I've done some work with Joel Shapiro also, and And I've written, and the manuscript I'm working on now has some other ekphrastic things, does have some ekphrastic things from music also. But what Terry mentioned, I think, is key. We share a kind of wandering between, you can call it concretion and abstraction, description and abstraction, but the abstraction is always very, I mean, look at the image right behind us. It's always very visceral, very palpable, active. There's nothing not concrete about it, right? And that for me is it's a very powerful place. It's been the place where my poetry has always emerged since my early 20s. And I think the real lure for me was I've spent so much time translating, where you're working in relation to something that other people can see you're working in relationship to. As a poet, we're always working in relation to something, but other people don't know what it is, and sometimes we don't know what it is, right? But when everyone can see what you're starting with, well, that's interesting. That relationality is something that I think is extremely important and magical. So, for example, when Terry invited me to work on this Drawing Center show, first he said it could be an essay, it could be a poem, whatever you feel like doing. And so we said, well, let's see the work. And my wife and I went up to his studio, and we spent the day with him and his Handel. And that process of just looking and talking that Terry described is there's sort of genetic material in there. I mean, it's something you just don't know where. You're just trying to get to know the work and everything around it. And I think, and Terry mentioned his relationship to language and the move from the visual into language. So one of the things that really caught my eye when we were in the studio was Terry's library. Right? After we had looked at the drawings for a while, I saw, oh wow, you really do have interesting books. A lot of the books that I have, and that kind of gave me a certain confidence, I think, to just follow out the line of my intuition in relation to that material. But I see it as to specifically get to what you're asking about. I see it as a translational act. Translation for me is about listening very, very carefully and, in a kind of organic, integrated way, and then responding. And there's a wonderful passage in the book of Exodus where Moses brings the people of Israel. He's around Sinai, and there's all this sort of thunder and lightning around Sinai. And the verse says that the people saw the voices or saw the sounds in the sky. And in relation to Terry's work, I feel like I am hearing the images, and I want them to determine. They take me out of myself, so I have absolutely no idea what I'm going to write. And I want them to take me somewhere completely unexpected. In the same way Terry said he's looking for signals back. So I'm looking for that visual work to determine, to produce sound in me, and then see where that sound goes. And but we have a couple things we'll show where that's working in different ways.
Yeah, I'm actually very glad that you brought up translation. That was something that I was wanting to ask about in terms of sort of how your work as a translator might inform your sort of ekphrastic work. But I think that is a rather kind of poetic segue into my follow-up question to this one. I am very much like Peter, am both a poet and a teacher of poetry. And one of the things that I have often heard, and one of the things I've often taught in poetry workshops is sort of this notion that a poem should, through its competent or elegant use of craft and imagination, that it should somehow teach its reader how it's supposed to be read. But then I wonder about how does a drawing accomplish this kind of concept? And so thinking about what you are mentioning about translation, I think it ends up being very important to what's happening. But what we're going to be thinking about next, and I'm curious if you two might maybe address the relationship in particular between sort of like language and literature and sort of its relationship to, in particular, like the silent visual image. You have, one, because there seems to almost be a kind of ventriloquism act that has to happen. That one medium sort of performing for the other in some way, that the reader or the viewer is required. It requires them to utilize a different set of senses by which to construct meaning. So I'm wondering if you two might sort of talk about the relationship between. And you've had many who have sort of written in conversation with your work. What is that relationship between sort of language and this more silent medium that you're working with, and how does that function for you?
What I said before about this, getting this signal back. So it starts from from circumstances that present themselves about suggesting a kind of project, and then this selfish need to want to get some kind of resonance reading back, and setting up this more complex diagram between the different works as you're suggesting, that there's a kind of triangulation off of the different media that might suggest another kind of meaning that I couldn't access through the drawings themselves.
Mm-hmm. And do you kind of have some of these particular meanings that show up in writing? Do you have those kinds of meanings in mind as well, or does that collaboration often sort of like reveal some things that are going on even to you?
No, that's the hope. That's the reason to start the project.
Yeah.
So there's nothing in mind initially other than the curiosity and the impulse to start.
Yeah, I should say that. So one of the things that happened in this project was I wrote. Terry showed me all the drawings, and Claire from the Drawing Center showed me all the drawings that were going to be in the show, and then gave me digital images of them all. So I spent a lot of time with them I think it was over the summer, but then deciding which ones to write about. Nobody said anything, you should, what you have to do. It was just, I sort of curated that group that I wanted to respond to. And that evolved over time. But then, then I gave Terry the finished poem, and some of them were published with some of the drawings in the Parish Review. And at a certain point, Terry said that he liked them so much he wanted to do a series of prints based on the poems, or in response to the poems, right? So that did cycle back, and that interested me in the same way that, I was curious, well, what are those signals I'm going to get back? And so the second thing we'll show you is that second cycle of all this. Of course, then the book artist that we were working with, because we were going to make a book of this, said, "Oh, but Peter wrote his first poems to drawings, and now Terry has prints, and we're going to print the prints, so Peter has to write new poems about the prints." And I could see, well, this could be a lifelong project. Terry said, "Well, you don't have to do that if you don't want." I said, "Well, let's see. I prefer to say yes, and then see what happens."
Well, the initial idea was for me to make prints of the drawings that had triggered Peter's poem, and I just came up against my own inability to do that, or to become interested in revisiting those drawings again. So I was working on a number of new drawings, which I developed into prints, which then we proposed to Peter for writing another text.
Right, and they had just happened to, Terry doesn't know this, but work into a long poem that I was writing, and I thought, oh, this is exactly what I need here. So then, yeah.
And I don't know, maybe this might be, you're going to get to see a little bit about this latter project that Terry and Peter are working on, or working towards a bit later, but maybe this might be a good place for you to actually share
Sure.
what you've done for this project.
So, I'm going to read. You see the instructions to push very hard. There we go. I think that's all right. You can hear me? Yeah. And this I have to use a remote, which I'm not very good at. There we go. Okay. So this is the poem that goes with the show that's downstairs, A Winter's Trail. And I have to use the remote while holding this, which is a little tricky, and turning the pages. We'll hope for the best. Drawing draws us in, involving us further and stretching attention. It sketches, reaching, inching in ink and grasping, graphite, graphing, drawing, draws us out of our cells and cells, extending thinking into seeing what was sensed or seen as something once in hand, in eye, or at the finger's tips. It leads one on to a place of twos and two, and into seeing what was sensed or seen as something once in hand, in eye, or at the finger's tips. It leads one on to a place of twos and two, or into arcs and depths as angles curve through layered swerves and lines as tines, drawing as first and quickest to the quick and draw, and yet it slows and flows, unfolding time, raveling mind. It tries out signs along a way, a wavering. It's a doodle dancing within its perfect incompletion, now a mesh and not a mess, a net that's working through a seam between us, drawing seems to hone what might be true, and turn by turn it trains, but doesn't tame like runes. It tunes us. Charcoal's quiet and chalky mist, cedar cones' emergence from its sinking here now into the page as, and of its absence and grays, there and not quite there yet mix. This dark plant glows with its ground and grows from a black fire of whiteness, so boundlessness pulses nearly in hand. Its smudged halo holds like a kiss, creation's lipstick, a fooling around. The nerve and zinc ascent of it, descending extension in every direction, knots of cinder and brightness as one, wash of ash through which it hums. Beneath the skin, these paths are thought. Odd how globs form morula, or constellations of single cells evolve as clocks of grape-like clouds, and scarlet clusters hovering near smears of immaculate whiteness become the drifting stalk and jot of an eye. Neurons fire in black and white, gouache and graphite, and unlike angels don't expire with ignition along a spine. Reaching the head we wander into, the frame and opening of an interim installation to which all roads have suddenly led. The eye slides beyond the rendering's frame and out through just about everything now we're seeing there in these winding lines, elided. Rhyme's a rhizome, rhyme is loam. When it's foam, the poem's not done. The poem's not done until it's a dome. The dome itself is a kind of poem, and even then there's more to come as the rhizome roams and its phonemes run. Up and slantwise down at once, through its phloem, the poem is one. Through its phloem, the poem is done. There is a score to all that isn't said, a constant buzzer hum enlarged, a pulse that soon becomes like something sung or spoken within. There is a string, no, there are wavering violins. We bring attention like a wish, a wind along a wall, or laundry line in clothespins, marking time with keys, shifting through an unquaint calm, and now a chaos of tangled thinkings twine in a drawer, a silent roar. The world is bound by secret knots. They say that what that means is hard to know, and flickers so also, and really Are those knots a noose that hangs, or ties that bind are being stuck or held together like a bridge to build and cross, or maybe draw on or up so no one can? There is a score to all that. Ink can twist itself around and form a spring from which things come to figure infinity in a glyph or couple facing a pale gray distance within one another's ominous shades, further off and frailer still, but in a picture just as well, like a trick or quip. Life, it seems, is penciled in a biblically cryptic script. This writing's on and off the wall and tells us what it is and why we're so intent on understanding. A layered saying that seems to say it all and nothing in particular. Just like everything seen by those who know it shows at best the whole in part that's growing with the telling and spell dangling in between, like someone listening into a certain sort of uncertainty, speaking of uncertainty as a song of songs truly tangled in our being led along a luminous line, singed and limbed within the singing, seeing us through. In arcs so dark it glows with its holding, the nothing it knows within its unfolding. Composing now a hardening spark's unhidden power, unbidden black. Undiamond white as softening graphite, crystal flaking gently breaks. Into an opaque night of fluorescence over a field behind a fence where a king's thinking of slipping tenses and the ancient art of riding wakes, or maybe only a day's mistakes. Here at a pointed end of a pencil from a parcel, and that's a start, as ink shines from the king's heart. How does this drawer hold it all within a space along a trace left on a surface marked as such? The world is drawn with water from a well, and then a gun or wagon now alone against collateral interest on a bank account, and maybe a conclusion. Drapes are drawn so light gets in, or doesn't. Someone draws attention, drawing even in a race he's drawn to, drawn aside or else asunder. Thus the luck of the draw, we call it, as has the drawing card, drawing cheers or blood, a breath or blank or cello's bow. And so he drew a bath or on a pipe, as she drew fire and ducked. The goose was shot and plucked, then drawn as dawn drew near. They drew together, playing on to a draw, drawing back again and again to the drawing board, and plans to hatch or links to sketch, like poems, yes, always those to draw on there within the proverbial drawer. Thank you.
All right. It's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. And again, that appears in the Drawing Center's book if you get a chance to
It was great to
find
hear Peter read
Yeah.
this, like, because I've read it a number of times, obviously, and also great to hear that, in a sense, like the invitation to do it came at a cross section into a project that Peter was already involved in, because in some sense, the whole notion of me going back to revisit something was so contrary to, I think, the way that both of us work, which is sort of trying to tap into some streams of energy that are current and present. So I think there was a way that it was very fortunate that we were both able to sort of channel these two separate but parallel interests at the same time.
Yeah. And I mean, having been able to spend time with both sides of it, it's just been interesting to sort of like see those two things sort of working together, and being able to just start to make some of those some of the connections between what your work is doing, Terry, and how your work is responding to
Right.
it.
So, like in traditional ekphrasis, you'll have, I don't know, a painting with people in it and characters, and a poet will comment or animate or dramatize what's going on in the scene. And of course, you'd have a hard time doing that with Terry's work, which is what drew me to it, right? And because I'm always interested in sound in poetry, maybe more than a lot of other poets, the abstraction or sort of borderline between abstraction and familiar, recognizable shapes that Terry's often working, I just found that incredibly provocative in terms of producing sound in me and letting me and encouraging me to do something similar. So in a way, this is probably one of the most extreme sound poems I've written, and it's kind of started a thing. I've gone further with it, and I just take great pleasure in this case letting the drawing draw. It's the idea. There's a beautiful passage in the Zohar, which is the sort of the major Kabbalistic book of the mystical Jewish tradition. So one of the poems I read, with the one with the sort of yellow lines, the kind of scramble of curvy lines. So there's a little, I don't know if you could see it on the screen, but there's some yellow in there. And I mentioned the Song of Songs in there, but it's not the Song of Songs, it's just the song that this is producing. But in the Kabbalistic commentary to the actual biblical book of Song of Songs, there is, instead of the two lovers of the Song of Songs calling to each other, this text has the letters calling to each other, and it says, "Draw me after you, let us run." And in a way, that's sort of what the whole poem is about, is the visual drawing me after, drawing the letters that I have at my hands or in my mouth, after them, and seeing what happens sort of on those hillsides, just let them arrange themselves. I mean, it's not unconscious, it's not automatic writing, but it is definitely not anything I would have ever produced without, responding to those drawings.
It's not automatic, but it's cursive, and I think that the way that writing and drawing are both are products of a kind of bodily gesture,
Absolutely,
in a sense,
yeah.
and a generation of particular kinds of formal elements that are used as a communication device. There's a very profound link between them there.
Yeah, it's so completely physical. Yeah, it's the distinction. It's not automatic in the sense of I'm writing with my body, with my torso, with my hand. I write longhand. I'm writing with my lips, with my tongue. I'm not so much writing with my rational brain in this case. I mean, there are connections being made, and I'm responding to things I'm reading to, but it's really being led by sound.
Well, and I guess maybe that brings me to sort of my next question was actually, I think along some of those lines, I wanted to talk a bit about texture, because I think that what both of you are working in, I would imagine, is to some extent very much informed by different kinds of texture. Whether for Terry, whether it's like, charcoal or chalk or gouache, graphite, crayon on paper. I mean, any of those decisions sort of must take the subject of texture into account. And so I'm curious how you would say the consideration of texture informs sort of the intention of a particular piece. And then I want to go on and ask you, Peter, because language and sound provide a completely different kind of texture. And there's obviously a rich sonic texture that's going on in the poem that you read. And we're through rhythm, through a repetition of diction, through rhyme, through the way in which words on the page certainly create different. We get to hear different things with when you see alone against in the latter section of the poem, we see alone, which is two words spelled A-L-O-A-N, but we also are challenged to hear alone as well, A-L-O-N-E.
Which is pretty much the way I hear ordinary conversation. Sometimes, to a fault, but I'm constantly hearing those slippages or, the possibilities of other readings that are diverging out from the sort of functional conversation we have. And that, for me, that's interesting. For other people, it's a nuisance.
I found it, I mean, it was when I sort of picked up got the drawing, the center of the Drawing Center's book, it was very important actually for me to spend time reading the poem aloud and really listening to the way in which the sound, some of those slippages that you talk about, and whether you hear it in a tension or we hear it in a immaculate, that there are all of these other readings that are created. But that does interest me, and so Terry, I wanted to come back. I'll come back to you, and then we'll talk further with Peter about this. But how does the consideration of texture when you start, when you have an idea in your mind and you are moving forward with it, how does texture come into play in terms of thinking about what you want to?
Well, every material is sort of the determining characteristic of what eventually will emerge as the subject. So it's not as if I have an idea in mind exactly. And I think that's where the difference is in terms of automatic writing. There's some sense that with automatic writing, there's some idea or some torqued idea that one wants to arrive at, rather than allowing the materials and the process of developing the language or the gesture to suggest a kind of meaning that couldn't be arrived at through just thinking.
Okay, and so you would say that you start with material first, and then that sort of begins to produce.
Yeah, and some way in, like sometimes an image, some imagery, but the material is always the way into beginning the process, whatever whichever way that then develops, the initial impulses through material.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that it's sort of similar for at least in this particular project for you, Peter? Sort of like, did you hear certain? I mean, you mentioned earlier, sort of like listening to each of these drawings. Did you just begin to hear certain phrases that would come up, or that would begin to generate these sort of sonic textures?
I mean, so first, when we were looking at the drawings in the studio, obviously I'm drawn to certain things at certain times, and also see certain connections between them that speak to the kind of work I've been doing. So they sort of begin right away to register on me. And it's a very physical thing. I mean, it's pleasant. This one lands over here, or that does this, and for example, do we still have this one? Yeah, like this one back here. Whoa, that's the poster for this show, for the UMass show. And when it was sent to me, I immediately framed it and put it up in my office at Yale. And every single student who comes and it's right above the table. I have a little table where we meet, and they all just say, "What's that? Wow!" And it just casts this spell. So before there are sounds, there's that visual response on the nervous system, really. And then that's a mysterious process how it begins to form sound, and then meaning, something like meaning, and towards meaning, away from meaning. I just spent a lot of time looking at them and writing in my notebook, and until something began to grow. I mean, maybe that's a good segue actually to the other project, which
because I think
which is the artist book that we're working on now. Because if this, as in this poem, the idea was drawing and being led on, being drawn by drawing. In this one, we're dealing with prints, and so I'm kind of a simple-minded guy at some level, and so I was interested in being imprinted, which is really what translation is for me. It's a kind of imprinting. It's a kind of being pierced, really. I mean, I think all art is that at some level, but certainly the history of translation and the experience of translation is a kind of Schleiermacher, the Greek theologian, German theologian, who also translated Greek and wrote a lot, some of the most important, or one of the most important essays in the history of translation, talks about being pierced by beauty, what will be the response to being pierced by beauty when you're responding in another language? How do you account for that? So this one, this book started with Terry. Let me see what we have back there. Yeah. So Terry showed me a bunch of the prints he was making. That was just this fall, right? I think October, something like that. And doesn't matter when, but
so long.
yeah,
It seems so long ago.
It was the past. It was definitely the past. And I think I picked like 20 of them, or I don't know, maybe he just wrapped them all up, gave them to me, and I said, can I take some back to Jerusalem so I can live with them a little bit? And he said, he gave me the whole thing, and brought them back, and I just put them on. This is our dining room table in Jerusalem. And so right there, I think of the ones he gave me at that point, I picked what we have here, 8, 10, 12. 8 fit in on the table. That was one constraint. But I was also just looking for patterns, what worked together, what was speaking to me and spoke to me as a group. And I'd have them on a table like that, and they'd be out there all day. And they would change a little bit over time. So there's some substitutions, and then on the right over here, there's one. I thought, oh yeah, I could use another shape there, and I didn't have that. He hadn't made a print of that one yet, but he sent me that, and in the black and white, and so that got subbed in, and then we moved things around a little. I moved things around a little more, and here's a really spooky one. The afternoon light coming through. But you can see, so I was looking at this stuff pretty much all day, every day. I'd go into my study, I'd come out, go into the kitchen, and the pleasure was just, it was like a kind of petri dish. Eventually, a little culture began to grow in that petri dish that became the poem. Let's see what we got here. Yeah, so this is the mock-up. The book hasn't been printed yet. Terry and Leslie Miller at the Grenfell Press they've been doing sort of finishing touches, I guess, this week or last week. And that was the first mock-up, and Terry added this kind of frontispiece. So, I mean, we have the rest of the poem. We can look at it in a second. It's short. But if you want to...
I was interested also in just this consideration of texture and thinking about sort of your earlier response, Terry, in terms of how you enter a piece. How has that process changed when it comes to sort of re-entering material? Like when you are writing something that's responding to Peter's poem, as opposed to something that's just completely new. Like does that change your process at all?
Well, the book made its own demands also. When Peter had paired a number of images with some of his text and sequenced it, and then there was some back and forth in terms of adding some images, or dropping an image, adding the frontispiece. I then added a cover image, and then we developed a colophon page. So it was really this sort of exchange of imagery and ideas. It wasn't so much that I was responding specifically to one phrase or word. It was more about the totality of the book. And for so long I had been working on the images as single pages, and with the kind of demands that they made on me. And then at a certain point, up at Grenfell Press, we folded it into the book, which so set up a whole other dynamic in terms of the sequencing and the kind of temporal dimension of the poem, and the way that Peter had distributed the words.
We also weren't sure whether it was going to be portfolio
yeah.
There was a lot of back and forth.
There was a lot of back and forth in terms of what it would be.
Yeah, and I would imagine that as you start to bring these things together, one of the other things I was curious about was sort of the notion of rhetoric. Poems generally tend to have a kind of rhetoric that's at work in them, and I would imagine that that's the same with visual art. And as you two have been working together, particularly on this second project, thinking about if there is a kind of or how does sort of the rhetoric of each particular form or medium, particularly as they're working together, sort of provide a opportunity or a space for a kind of sense making? That's one of the things that gets talked about a lot, I think, in Claire Gilman's introduction to your work, this notion of sense making. And how do you approach that sort of notion?
Well, I'm just sort of making these images and then developing them into prints and working within the constraints and parameters of this one particular press I was working, which was dealing with relief printing and literally the particular press they had and the capacities of the printers themselves and what was available to me in this one press. And then, Peter gave me back this thing, beginning being an engine. It was like he could have stopped right there for me. I mean, that was like what I wanted. I wanted some notion about what is this driving force of me building all these images. And so that's the selfish component of me wanting to collaborate with someone, was to get something back like that. That bit of language, which is a clue to me about what my own project is about.
And that notion of making sense that Claire writes about, she didn't know, but I have an essay on translation, which is sort of, it's like my most comprehensive statement, if you want to put it that way. It sounds a little pompous, but it's the first time I really tried to sort of get down on paper what it is that matters to me and how I go about, how I think one should go about translating, how I teach translation, how I translate. And the essay is called Making Sense in Translation. And it's, the two basic lines of thought are, of course, one has to make sense, common sense, which actually a lot of translations don't, if you look carefully, right? They haven't actually figured out that it has to all add up. But what separates, I think, good translations from bad or mediocre translations is the sensuous element. It's only when the sensory system is engaged and activated, as it is in good original work, that a translation is going to come alive and have a life of its own. And that's that's a product of the quality of reception, of listening. And a lot of labor on the other side. There's a lot of sort of psychic labor also involved in that. But that making sense is everything.
Yeah. And maybe as you sort of get into some of the work that's gone into this particular project, did you see at least your sort of rewriting of poems or reapproaching of poems to be different this time around, or do you still feel like they were being led by some of that sonic texture?
It was a little different. It was definitely led by a response to what I was hearing texturally and in terms of shape and color and pattern and grain in the work. We'll see in a second. But I do think that notion that these are prints, that the metaphor of being imprinted was really, it created, it just pushed me rather than led me. It pushed me in a different direction, and the sounds emerged in a slightly different way. Just not to turn it into a big dramatic thing, but just so you can see. So this, that I decided was the opening. Beginning being an engine's emergence, late in a game, and oh, an opening, how, and again, really. And that was all just sort of generated by that shape, which I had a very visceral response to. And one word gave way to the next, beginning being an engine's emergence, So it's literally just a kind of improvisation, a kind of a sound improvisation. So these are like prose stanzas, really. You can take them on their own as a kind of commentary to the print, but they also string together. So an opening, how, and again, really, already, a budding, or not, here we come, from behind, behold, ahead of what we've done, or are we? So also playing on the knock, knock, here we come, that kind of thing. And for me, this is all kind of genetic material and what's going on. And the wood grain that Terry printed this on, I just love that. And of course, I put it on our dining room table, which is what kind of wood? It's maple wood made in Kentucky. Somehow that got shipped to Jerusalem. Never figured out how.
And
that got.
the wood grain is actually a rubbing I did of my drawing table.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I mean, just like all that, and the drawing, and he told me that, and one of my favorite poets is John Wiener's, was John Wiener's, he's still a favorite, but a Boston poet, and Ginsberg called him, his poem to the product of a shattered mind at a certain point, but an interviewer once asked him, how did you come up with the image, and how did you learn this kind of music? And he said, arm against the hard brown desk. All my life that's been with me, arm against the hard brown desk. So then we go on to hosting. So what was the last thing we left off with? Ahead of what we've done, or are we hosted something, haunting, coping, copying, closer, coding, copiously keeping, to align a slipping feeling for a formal, coming always into being. So it's really commenting now on the process of the composition itself. Gin within that fate in the game as flesh map were cut in thoughts reaching into the grain of things. The ground, a pining rippling, a rubbing of rings, widens a dark, dividing us from and into selves as cells, shifting, not quite black to white, but wide from tight through seeds of seeing, a start like spores released to doors at once beyond, and still at heart, returning up. As one, the ochre embers float the ball, which holds it all, the lightness of its lifting, so that she's within, what's felt without, the frame maintains its digits distance, bringing near a surface, bearing what we hear, and now at hand, inflected there. Is that an ear or crown? We, where the swarms of voicing scanned, connect the dots through doubt or debt and wing it. So that's the end of that poem. So there's kind of angelic thing here, but I also had in mind those voices I talked about with they saw the voices on Mount Sinai, and kind of that was a kind of model for me. So this poem ended up fitting in. I've just not quite finished a poem based on the Hebrew letters, which is also an ekphrastic thing, because I wanted to see, could I write a poem based on letters, an alphabet, which are also visual, right, signs, that, and when my audience knows nothing about any of them, any of those, I have to assume no knowledge whatsoever, but can I just get them to respond with me to the visual fact of these letters? And so this is towards the end of that poem, and it's for the letter Resh, which is like the R, and it, in a lot of rabbinic commentary, there's lots of comments about all the letters, but one of the things that it's associated with is beginning. And so it just kind of perfectly, naturally, organically stepped right in and took its spot in that poem.
No, I think that's really beautiful. And just in seeing that, I mean, there is obviously very much conversation that's happening between the two works, but they are very distinct.
Right, right. Well, there's also the whole kind of John Cage, Merce Cunningham thing where you just put the two things together without, this is not that, right? I'm interested in some kind of dialogue, but it's not a one-to-one thing in any way, just as I think translation should never be a one-to-one thing. That's dead,
Right, and I think that one of the things that could easily be argued about translation in general, and I'm curious on your take on this as well, Terry, is sort of the notion of just even the act of translating a work is to some extent already sort of inadvertently a failure, in the sense that regardless of the form it takes, it won't be in the form that it was originated. And so even as you're sort of like approaching material and repurposing certain, maybe certain images or certain or certain sort of like patterns that you've been working in. It almost seems like a kind of translation that's taking place, albeit a translation of your own work.
It's a translation, but at the same time, it's just it's what William Burroughs called a third mind, and that each my images, Peter's poem, each have an independent existence of their own, and this third thing has come into existence through this collaboration, which is what the hope always is, that there's this other thing that wouldn't have come into being without the two-part program.
Yeah.
They're just also about what you say about translation is completely true and untrue. But it's also completely true and untrue about original composition. And that's the thing. Is like, so you have so many artists who writers. Valerie is one of the classic ones. A poem is never finished; it's just abandoned. But my favorite is the Beckett. Ever tried, ever failed, no matter. Try again, fail better. Yeah. And he's talking about himself writing, so.
Yeah. And I did want to ask, because, we're getting sort of the complete picture of all of this, and it makes it, look like it's, it's all sort of nice and easily done. But surely I know that there are tons of challenges that go into the composition and the collaboration of this kind of work, and I was curious as to what were, or if there were, some notable hiccups that you had with just trying to get this thing together. What were some of those challenges that you had to push past?
Well, just getting a print I wasn't embarrassed by. It's all kind of a struggle. There's some sense that I've been thinking more and more about painting or any kind of project as a combination of carpentry and catastrophe. That there's a sort of
book title.
There's a civilized behavior around doing a book project and having a publisher and making the images, but at a certain point, to push the imagery and the amplitude of the project beyond some set limit for oneself, you have to go to some place that's very uncomfortable and unknown, that is a little less civilized, and that's where the real images come out of.
And is it similar for you, Peter, in terms of like feeling a certain kind of satisfaction for what you've produced, or I'm not sure how much revision goes into as you're working in.
There's a lot of revision, but working with Terry is very easy in the sense that he listens, he's patient, it happens fairly naturally. The difficulty is the same difficulty, he said, in the sense of, I don't want to produce something that will be embarrassing, that will disappoint him. There's that terror of, maybe you have nothing to say. When we'll see what happens, and maybe it will be nothing. And but that's all writing, right? It's just now you do it with someone else, and there's a certain expectation, and maybe even a deadline, and there's a show, and when you're translating dead writers, they're not going to respond, at least not directly. They have their ways.
And when can we expect this particular project, or is there already a date set for it?
No, but it's being printed right now. And and will the prints come here at any point, you think? Come here? I don't know. Yeah. No plans. First, we want to get the object. We're making the object.
Yeah, which is really great. Well, I wanted to actually leave a little bit of time for a little bit of Q&A for folks who might. I have tons of questions, but there may be some people in the audience who may also have some questions for either Terry or Peter or both as well, regarding this project, regarding some of the other work that's been shared and shown. But yeah, we certainly invite your questions. Yeah.
For both of you, but Peter in particular, you mentioned the sensory, and I wonder if a CD came with this book, because I always think poetry engages my senses when I hear the poet read the work in response to this other art form. And it sounds to me like, Terry, you didn't hear one of the poems, at least, until tonight, right? So there's something for me about a gap, possibly, in the work. And would you consider the value of adding that other sensory dimension for us to appreciate the marriage in a...
You can read it out loud to yourself.
It's not as the poet creates it.
I love reading poetry, and if a publisher would like to put a CD in every one of my books, I will not object.
It's just tough to get CD players anymore, right?
Yeah.
I think they have to come with like just downloadable links.
That little chip you just put under your shoulder and.
Yeah, and you've been working with, you say, acoustics with music too. Has that been a different process?
So yeah, it's a process I don't really understand yet, but I'm very much taken with this kind of this work, and particularly with as abstract things. So I wrote a poem. It's in Hymns and Qualms. That was a kind of response to the composer Morton Feldman. Incredibly delicate, minimalist, new music. I've listened to Morton Feldman for God knows how many hours in my life. And all I wanted to do was account for some of the sensations that listening to him sort of, sends up in me. And so it's a very indirect kind of ekphrasis. But the fact that these poems that I do with Terry are so much music-based, it's just part of an extension of that impulse.
Other questions?
This is for Terry. We've talked so much about sound, but you haven't said much about sound in your work. And I'm curious, do you hear your pieces or do you see them more as images or both?
I see them as images, and maybe feel them as images in a way that one might feel or get a sense of sound in that way, and hope to build an image that's multi-directional the way that sound is multi-directional.
I think there's also a kind of choreographic element to what you're asking, in the sense that dance is a place where, Terry, how did you just put it, but multi-directional, that there's, the visual meets the sculptural, meets movement, meets time. Those are all qualities. Time is, the thing about sound is that it's time, right? That's what interests me, is that kind of concrete, abstract sense of when time enters the work.
And there's also that sense that McLuhan talked about acoustic space and how electronic space is acoustic space. And there's some sense in the imagery I'm trying to develop that has that kind of multidimensional, scale-free quality, musical quality.
Yeah, because even some of your drawings would even seem like they are sort of responding to, or at least imaging the body on a kind of molecular level, thinking about just even some of those pulsings and sensations that sort of run at the deepest levels of sense in some fashion. So I find that interesting, that you're sort of this vein that you're working in.
One can only hope.
Yeah. And other questions?
Question about how your work, both of your work, reaches different audiences. So I think with Terry, you've spoken about how your work can be read different ways by different people, and it has multiple readings, I think, built into it in a certain way. But then I'm wondering if there have ever been instances where you felt people didn't connect to it, and that you changed it because, I don't know. I was thinking about.
There have been instances where people didn't connect to it.
But in a sense, I'm curious how different types of audiences read it. Like, I don't know, scientists or noticed in the poem when the word she came up on the page before this one, suddenly I read it, I had a reaction that, what is this she, who is she, am I her, am I not her? So it changed it for me because it went from a kind of universal, in a good sense, kind of. I was thinking about universality when we were saying we are drawn, and there's a sense that the poem in the catalog really speaks to just the human experience that drawing does to us. So, but then pronouns change that. So I was thinking about it both in the text and is there a way that has come up in your imagery, Terry, that you've ever felt that people misconnected or misread your work?
I don't think there really is a possibility for misconnection as long as there's a connection. And in a sense, I'm trying to engineer the images to a point where they allow for these kinds of multiple readings, and that's part of the energy I get off of them from moving them to that edge of likeness, that they possess a kind of likeness despite their abstract quality.
And I also know that your work tends to there are many different museums sort of all over the world that house them, house your works, and maybe an extension to that question, like have you found different kinds of responses, like regionally? Have there been different sort of things that happen, maybe similar work that's responded to just because of regional aspects, or?
Nothing I can discern. I'm just not sensitive enough.
And I don't know if distribution or audience is. I would imagine as you begin to move into things that are a bit more sound based, that's going to have a different effect on audience. And so, is that something that you're considering as well, Peter, as you're working?
We're poets, so we're talking about a different scale here of readership or audience. You just never know what's going to speak to the other day, someone was teaching my book at the Yale Divinity School, and they had me in for a class, and a woman asked about a particular poem, and the poem's called "Why Are You Here?" And she said, the poem made me think about Jerusalem, and I was in Jerusalem once, and she went on and on and on. The poem has nothing to do with Jerusalem. It was written in Jerusalem, but as far as I'm concerned, it has nothing to do with Jerusalem. But I loved hearing her go on about this, and I thought, if that's in the poem, then good. I've won in a certain sense that the poem contains. Is the poem really about, why one bothers to write a poem at all? Like, what is one doing using language in this way when one could be doing a lot of other different things? And so you just don't know really often what's going to connect.
I haven't had any feedback from the Yale Divinity School yet.
That can be arranged.
Yes.
That can be arranged.
Yes.
Yeah. In fact, maybe being arranged right now.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, my question connects to what you were talking about. I'm curious about that time when the prints were on your table.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's a way that the prints and language function like oil and water. There's a moment of resistance in language. And I'm curious what you rejected. What language you rejected that just didn't fit?
What language or which images?
No, what language? Were there ever ideas, concepts, things that became too particular, too limiting, that you needed to reject in order to really be somewhat in sync with what you consider?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that when I am composing, and if I throw something out, I tend to repress it and forget that it ever existed. Another thing happened to me recently. Somebody printed out a poem of mine from the internet, and I looked at it and I said, how did those lines get to be like that? And it turns out it was a much earlier version of a poem I had written, and I had no memory, at least immediately available memory of ever having written those lines, So the mind is very strong in pushing them out. But yeah, when I was going through all the different prints on the table and moving them around, I was scribbling little bits here and there, maybe not whole stanzas or fragments. And then I started moving the fragments around, and there's a lot of that. There's a lot of trial and error and play, a lot of play, for sure. And the ones that, there's another poem in my last book, which, it's a poem that I had written when my father died, because, back to drawing, in his papers, I found a bundle of pencils that had on them, they were imprinted with the way pencils can say from whatever, the Museum of Fine Arts or whatever. It said 1936 Chevrolet, always a leader. And because his father was a Chevy dealer in Paterson, New Jersey, and that just got me, and I grew up in Paterson, and I tried to write with them and sharpen it without, and I thought, this is really spooky. And the erasers didn't work because they were too dry. And so I wrote a poem about that. But it was very different from the poems I was writing at the time, so I put it away. And when I was putting together my next book, I found that poem in some of my papers. And I thought, what is this? I completely forgot that I had written it, but it's a poem I'm very attached to. So, things happen in mysterious ways.
You brought up Valérie a bit earlier, so the notion of the poem being abandoned, not being finished. And I guess that does also beg the question for both of you, is because the mind is given to its obsessions. And we can continually come back to the same material time and time again. How do you know when you're finished with something? How do you know when it's finally time to move on to something else?
I'm going to quote a wonderful poet and dance critic, Edwin Denby, writing about de Kooning. He says at the end of a free verse sonnet, when he's painted himself out of it, de Kooning knows his picture's finished. So there's a kind of feeling, it's a kind of sense of completion or a kind of click where you're just, it's a thing unto its own now. And if you do any more, you're just going to interfere and make it worse.
And do you find that that's the same for you? Like, even if as your mind is maybe seized on a certain maybe series of images or a particular shape or pattern, that you kind of have a similar sense of when you...
Yeah, I don't think there's any improving on Edwin Denby and Willem de Kooning. That's the sense. Something's exhausted and one is no longer connected through some umbilical cord of anxiety or need with the work, and you're suddenly outside of it and can't get back in.
Wonderful. Any other or final questions? Annie.
I keep thinking, and I don't know who to address this question to, but I keep thinking, how do you follow the inaudible that's in sound, in language, the invisible that's at the edge of the image and in the image, but not there? And how does that affect one another's threshold of being able to do that? I just keep thinking this question about, I can't articulate it right. It has to do with the inaudible and the invisible.
Well, you just articulated it.
Is this more like almost like negative space, but maybe... Yeah.
Well, it sort of goes with the ineffable. And I am a big believer in language as being our best bet to get at the inaudible and ineffable, not directly, but as a kind of trap or reflection of, or echo of all those things that you mentioned. So I also translate a lot of mystical poetry, Kabbalistic poetry, and it's in that tradition, the point isn't to get beyond language to silence. The point is sort of the way you just put it very beautifully, is to get to the ineffable and the invisible and all that within language itself, so that while we go on talking to each other, it's all there.
I mean, and to quote de Kooning again, I mean, de Kooning said that painting is forever mute, but it's something you can talk about forever. And I think that it's that talking and that sense of trying to articulate what these connections are and what these feelings are is that's the art part. He said that's the art part.
I like that. And that may actually be a really great place to actually close this conversation. We do want to leave a little bit of space and time for those of you who maybe haven't seen the exhibit yet, or who might want to go back after hearing a bit of the conversation here, to go back and maybe see the exhibit with just a new perspective on it, which I believe Loretta was saying is going to be open until 8 tonight.
Yes, and the books are available as well in the lobby.
Yes, wonderful. Was there anything more that any other housekeeping notes for?
Just gratitude for a beautiful conversation.
No, thank you to both Terry Winters and Peter Cole for being here tonight. Thank you all for being here, and hopefully you'll buy books or you'll go and see the exhibit, and have a really wonderful evening.